All right, so let's start this chapter 8 on the peripheral nervous system. I'm going to go to slide 3 and start there. We're going to talk about, we've already talked about the central nervous system that processes sensory information coming into the central nervous system from the peripheral nervous system. So we'll talk about kind of the sensory division here shortly, and then the motor division that the central nervous system utilizes to respond to the sensory information. So the peripheral nervous system is basically a network of peripheral nerves. So think about cranial nerves. Cranial nerves are divided into 12 pairs structurally, and they connect directly to the brain. Spinal nerves, there's 31 pairs, and they connect directly to the spinal cord. So you can see them here. There's a figure of them. Let me get my cursor. Cranial nerves, again, they originate. They're the cell bodies of these nerves, the neurons that make up these nerves. And a nerve is a bundle of axons, basically. So the cell bodies of these nerves, bundles of axons, are located in the brain, somewhere in the brain or the brain stem. Cranial nerves are. Spinal nerves, their cell bodies are just typically located in the spinal cord. So there's cell bodies there located, and there's the axons of those cell bodies, from those cell bodies extend out to a target tissue to cause a response. Every spinal nerve, so the structure of a spinal nerve, every segment of the spinal cord is connected to a pair of spinal nerves, and surrounding that is a layer of connective tissues. And those connective tissues are basically coverings around the nerve that protect and isolate the nerve. So the epineurum, think epi is on top of, is the outermost covering. It's dense, irregular connective tissue. So there's lots of collagen fibers that are really strong and help protect the whole nerve. And it just basically bundles the nerve together, all the axons in that nerve together. There's 2 other layers underneath that, so deep to that epineurum, that surrounds a bundle of axons called a fascicle. That's called the perineurium. So there's another layer of connective tissue that surrounds a bundle of axons. That bundle of axons is called a fascicle. And the endoneurium is the innermost layer, and that surrounds an individual axon. So you have layers upon layers upon layers of protective connective tissue that also isolates those neurons from, and the nerve itself, from the surrounding tissue. So here's a figure of it. You can see there's the epineurum. It's an outermost layer of connective tissue. One of these bundles is called a fascicle. So there's perineurium around a fascicle, right? And an endoneurium, there's an individual axon. So right here's myelin, right? So this is one axon. There's the endoneurium. And each spinal nerve has branches. And a branch is called a rami, or a ramus is a singular version. There's a dorsal ramus, so think dorsal is posterior. That ramus is what, basically it's just a bundle of axons that are headed to innervate muscles and joints and skin on the posterior side, so on your back. The ventral ramus is another arm, so think about a spinal nerve branching to 2 branches. The dorsal branch is called a dorsal ramus, and a ramus is an arm or a bar-like structure. That heads to the posterior side of the body, so the dorsal side. The ventral ramus innervates structures in the lateral and anterior trunk and limbs. So where the dorsal ramus doesn't have points of innervation, the ventral ramus does. In the thoracic and upper lumbar segments, basically these rami are carrying motor output along axons, so action potential information, of the sympathetic nervous system. And the sympathetic nervous system is one division of the autonomic nervous system. Remember, autonomic nervous system is modulating and controlling glands and internal organs like the heart and the lungs. And the sympathetic division of that is controlling the fight or flight response. So increases in heart rate or increases in breathing rate. Remember, the other division is the parasympathetic division. So here are the rami. So this is, remember, the dorsal root and the ventral root, and where they come together is a spinal nerve. So right here is a spinal nerve. I think we've talked about this back in chapter 7. That spinal nerve then branches to a dorsal ramus and a ventral ramus. So these are branches. These are just past the intervertebral foramen. So if this is a spinal cord, remember the ventral root is carrying motor information, action potential information, and the dorsal root is receiving sensory information. So you have this one-way route, basically, into and out of, right? Spinal nerve. The spinal nerve then branches to the dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus. Every spinal nerve innervates and information there is monitored by way of what's called a dermatome. So a spinal nerve innervates a particular region of the skin, the surface of the skin, and that's monitored by one pair of spinal nerves. Remember, there's 31 spinal nerves on either side of the spinal cord, so there's pairs of them, one on each side. And basically, you can diagnose specific locations of spinal cord damage or spinal nerve damage using these dermatomes. So take a look what they look like on the next slide. So this, so take a look, there's T1. So this is the first thoracic region of the anterior side of the body, right? So this is T1. This whole blue strip here is a dermatome. So that dermatome has nerves that innervate areas of that entire blue strip, that entire dermatome. So we say that this spinal nerve monitors that area. And if you know the disease shingles and how it manifests, basically shingles is a viral infection of the dorsal root ganglia. Remember, the dorsal root ganglia is where cell bodies of sensory neurons are located. It's caused by a particular virus that also causes herpes. It's basically the same herpes virus that causes chickenpox. But shingles is basically what comes back later in life. Usually it manifests in older individuals, but it basically attacks neurons within the dorsal roots of the spinal nerves and the sensory ganglia of those of cranial nerves, and basically produces a really painful rash and blisters. And you can see that rash and blisters along the dermatome, basically where the dorsal root ganglia are infected. That whole dermatome from that spinal nerve is affected as well. So you can see basically where the nerves, the rash and the blisters come from. Right there is an example of shingles. So this here, travel the path of this. This is a dermatome innervated by one cranial nerve. So this is shingle, what shingles would look like. And you can see it travels along one dermatome. So I'm going to flip back a couple slides and show you. There's the dermatome. So one of the dermatomes that was affected was probably, if the belly button's right around in here, probably T8 or T9. So thoracic 8 or thoracic 9 in this individual. Pretty cool, right? All right. That's just a review slide. And then we're going to talk about cranial nerves. So what you need to know about cranial nerves is their name. They're also numbered. So there's 1 through 12, and they're numbered based on Roman numerals. So like cranial nerve 10 is an X. And that X just lost my slide. There we go. That X designates the number 10. So these cranial nerves are also classified as sensory, purely sensory. So they can be only receiving sensory information and sending that sensory information to the brain or spinal cord. They can be motor and only sending motor information from the central nervous system somewhere to the periphery, to a target tissue. Or they can be a combination of the two, mixed. They could have both sensory axons and motor axons mixed into one nerve. Remember, one nerve is a bundle of axons. So it's basically encased in the connective tissue layers we talked about. So those axons can be only sensory, can be only motor, or they can be a combination of the two. And the name basically relates to the appearance or the function. So we'll talk about those as we go. The Roman numerals basically correspond to the position on the brain. So cranial nerve 1 is closest to the anterior side of the brain, and cranial nerve 12 is closest to the posterior side of the brain, and even down into the brain stem. So here's what we're gonna go through and what you need to know. This is a figure of all of them, their names. We're gonna go through them one by one and discuss their name, number, function, location, and whether they're sensory, motor, or both. mixed. So those are the key components of what you need to know, and we're going to talk about that now. So like the olfactory nerve, you need to be able to locate it. So it's here. Especially for lab, you should be able to locate it and identify it. So the olfactory nerve is cranial nerve 1. And that olfactory nerve has an olfactory bulb. If you see the bulb, follow that bulb to right here. Here is also the olfactory bulb. There's olfactory foramina. Remember, a foramen in the skull is a hole. So there's olfactory foramina in the ethmoid bone. And that's where the nerves that have sensory receptors out in the nasal cavity send action potential information up to the olfactory bulb and then back to the brain along what's called the olfactory tract, which is here. So this whole cranial nerve 1 is the olfactory nerve. It is purely sensory, and you're basically responsible for your sense of smell. So its name, olfactory nerve, its number, cranial nerve 1. You need to be able to identify it. So there's point number 3. Whether it's sensory, motor, or mixed. 4 is sensory. And 5, what is its job? So what is its function? It is responsible for your sense of smell. The optic nerve is cranial nerve 2. And we've got 2 cranial nerves on this slide. Actually, 4 cranial nerves on this slide. So we're going to spend some time here and talk about each of their functions. So right there was the olfactory nerve. And here's the optic nerve. And this is cranial nerve 2. So the optic nerve has a cross, and basically the optic nerve, right here it is, coming out of the eye, right? So the posterior side of the eyeball is the optic nerve, and then it crosses over here. So you can see there's half of an X. That's called the optic chiasm. And basically it's sensory. It's responsible for your sense of vision. So it's special sensory. And the innervation is basically the retina, which we'll talk about later, of the eye. So cranial nerve 3 is the oculomotor nerve. So think oculomotor. What might it do? Move the eye, right? So the oculomotor nerve is purely motor. It's cranial nerve 3. So there's name, number, sensory motor, or mixed. It's motor. So there's 3 points. The 4th is it innervates the extrinsic eye muscles and in some intrinsic eye muscles. So the extrinsic eye muscles are the muscles that move your eye. So if you look up or roll your eyes or look to the right or look to the left or look down, those muscles are skeletal muscles that you have control over that you can use because of the innervation from the oculomotor nerve. And that oculomotor nerve, if you follow it, is right there where my pointer is. That's the oculomotor nerve. And that oculomotor nerve not only innervates the extrinsic eye muscles that physically move the eyeball, but it also innervates some intrinsic eye muscles and an eyelid muscle that helps you open your eyes. The trochlear nerve innervates so there's 6 extrinsic eye muscles. There are 4 of them innervated by the oculomotor nerve. One of them is innervated. The trochlear nerve innervates one of the 6 extrinsic eye muscles, and that's its sole function. So it's motor only. It's cranial nerve 4, and it innervates one of the 6 extrinsic eye muscles. It's called the superior oblique muscle. We haven't really talked about that yet, but we will when we get to special senses in a later chapter. So we will come back to this muscle. So for right now, I want you to know that the trochlear nerve innervates one of the 6 extrinsic eye muscles, and those are the muscles that move the eye. Okay. The abducens, so we're going to skip cranial nerve 5 right now because the optic nerve innervates the eye. These are all the nerves, the cranial nerves that go to and from the eye. So we're focusing on this one slide because all of these nerves in some way innervate the eye. The optic nerve is all sensory. The oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens, number 6, are all motor. So the optic nerve is purely receiving sensory information from the eye and sending it to the brain. The brain is basically sending information from the brain to the by way of the oculomotor nerve, the trochlear nerve, and abducens to the muscles of the eye, so the extrinsic eye muscles. And the abducens, if the oculomotor nerve innervates 4 of the 6 extrinsic eye muscles, the trochlear innervates 1, so that's 5 total. The abducens innervates the last one, so the sixth extrinsic eye muscle. So it's also purely motor. And it is located right here. So right where my cursor is right there, that's the abducens. So this would be on here, let's reiterate, optic nerve, and it's also located right here, this big thick nerve. The oculomotor, right here's the trochlear, this thin one here. This is cranial nerve 5, we'll talk about next. And there's the abducens, cranial nerve 6. So all of them are located close to each other, and all 4 of them innervate in some way the eye. Number 5 is called the trigeminal nerve. So cranial nerve 5 is the trigeminal. So it has 3 branches. Tri is 3, right? So the trigeminal nerve has 3 branches. Look at this face up here. This is all of the innervation for just one cranial nerve. So it's a huge nerve. It has, and because it's so big and because it has so many branches, it's not a purely sensory, and it's not purely motor. It is a mixed cranial nerve. So it has some sensory information coming in from the face, the lips, and the palate, and the tongue. So there's the trigeminal nerve is partly responsible for your sense of taste. And motor is sent to muscles of mastication, and mastication is chewing. So the trigeminal nerve also helps you chew. So there's sensory and motor fibers here. And right here's the trigeminal nerve. Remember, I'll go back, olfactory is 1, cranial nerve 1, optic, cranial nerve 2, oculomotor, cranial nerve 3, trochlear, cranial nerve 4. Here's the trigeminal, cranial nerve 5, and then we have already talked about 6, which is the abducens. The facial nerve, it heads to the face, so it innervates the face, right? The facial nerve is also a mixed cranial nerve. It's cranial nerve 7. It has sensory fibers, axons, coming in from taste receptors on the tongue. And it also, so this is 2/3 responsible for your sense of taste. And there's motor fibers that move to muscles of facial expression. So like smiling or frowning, laughing, those anytime you move, I guess smiling and frowning are great examples. The lacrimal gland that produces tears, and salivary glands, which help break down food in the mouth. So they're also helpful in digestion. And salivary glands produce saliva, right? So here's some sensory coming in from the tongue, and over here is the facial 7, cranial nerve 7. And then motor is in pink there, headed out to the muscles of the face. The vestibulocochlear nerve. This is a really big word, but if you break it down, we're going to talk about 2 structures in the ear later. And these 2 structures are located right here. One of the structures is called the vestibule, and one of these structures is called the cochlea. This looks like a seashell. That's called the cochlea. So the vestibulocochlear nerve innervates the vestibule and the cochlea. And it's purely sensory. It's responsible for your sense of hearing. The glossopharyngeal nerve is cranial nerve 9, and it's a mixed nerve. So if you look here, right here was the abducens. Right here is facial 7, 8, vestibulocochlear, and there's 9. Glossopharyngeal. So we'll talk about 10, 11, and 12 next. So this is 9. It is mixed. There's sensory coming in from the last third of the tongue. So this is the third that's all this, and the nerve we talked about, the facial nerve, are responsible for your sense of taste, the pharynx and the palate. And then motor fibers are headed to pharyngeal muscles, and also another salivary gland. So you've got 3 different types of salivary glands. One of the salivary glands is innervated by the facial nerve, and one is innervated by the glossopharyngeal. The vagus nerve, its nickname is the wandering nerve. So it's a cranial nerve, but it has a really big job. It's mixed. It has sensory fibers coming in from the ear, the diaphragm, which is your muscle of breathing, and some internal organs like the heart, the lungs, and the digestive system organs. And there are motor fibers headed to the palate in your mouth, the back of your throat, which are basically, it's called the pharynx. So there's pharyngeal muscles there, and organs all throughout the thoracic and abdominal cavities. So look at this innervation. There's the heart, the lungs, the stomach, small in the large intestine. Up here is the pharynx area, so just below kind of the throat or just below the mouth. So the vagus nerve is basically one of the biggest nerves that we have in terms of the parasympathetic nervous system. And the parasympathetic nervous system works with the sympathetic nervous system to create the autonomic nervous system. But whereas the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for fight or flight, so kind of speeding things up like heart rate and breathing rate, the vagus nerve makes up 75% of the parasympathetic nervous system. And that's the nervous system that slows things down. It's nicknamed the rest and digest system. The accessory nerve is purely motor. It's cranial nerve 11, and it basically innervates skeletal muscle of the palate, so the roof of your mouth, the pharynx, your throat, the larynx, which is your voice box, the sternocleidomastoid muscle, which is this muscle here we've talked about before, and the trapezius muscle, which is also a muscle we talked about before. So the innervation here is purely skeletal muscle, which is muscles you have control over. And right here is the accessory nerve. And it runs, so if this is the pons and medulla, this runs down the brainstem towards the spinal cord. So we've got 7 facial, 8 vestibulocochlear, 9 glossopharyngeal, 10 vagus, and 11 accessory. The hypoglossal, under the tongue. Glossal is tongue. So the hypoglossal nerve is purely motor, and it heads to the muscles of the tongue. We talked about cranial nerves earlier that have innervation that's purely sensory, coming from the tongue, basically the taste receptors on the tongue. This is headed to the tongue, the muscles there that innervate to help you when you're chewing and trying to digest food. So from cranial nerves, we're going to continue to talk about some branches off of spinal nerves. We're going to take a turn back towards the spinal nerves and talk about some of these branches. So we talked about a dorsal ramus and a ventral ramus. Off of the ventral ramus branches a bunch of nerves that interweave with one another. So these complex interwoven networks of nerves are called plexuses, or a nerve plexus. And you have 4 that branch off of the spinal cord. One in the cervical region. One's called the brachial, so it's the lower cervical, upper thoracic, but that brachial plexus heads to the brachial, basically innervates muscles in the brachial region. And these plexuses innervate skeletal muscle and skeletal muscle only. So these are somatic motor nerves. The lumbar and sacral, so these are all just regions of the spinal cord, right? So right here's the cervical plexus. Off of spinal nerves C1, so cranial 1 to cranial 5, C5, branches the cervical plexus. The brachial plexus, which you can actually see here is the brachial plexus, branches off of C5 to T1. And then the lumbar plexus is located in here, so you actually see it here, but there's the location, the spinal nerve segments that it branches off of, and the sacral plexus branches off of the lowest here. So we're going to talk about these plexuses and 1 or 2 major nerves that branch off of each of these plexuses that innervate and what they do. So what's the function of those nerves? And they innervate mostly skeletal muscle. So the cervical plexus is located right here. So there's roots, basically the ventral rami of spinal nerves C1 to C5 branch off and become this plexus. And the major nerve that branches off of it is called the phrenic nerve. The phrenic nerve supplies innervation to the diaphragm, your major muscle of breathing. It's a really important muscle. The brachial plexus, again, it branches off of ventral rami from the spinal nerve. Remember, the spinal nerve branches to a ventral and dorsal ramus. But the ventral rami continue to branch and interweave those nerves that branch off of the ventral rami from C5 to T1 and become the brachial plexus. And this brachial plexus innervates the pectoral girdle and the upper limbs. So the nerves here that are innervated, so here's your pectoral girdle, right? Remember the shoulder, basically the shoulder girdle is made up of the clavicle and scapula, and then the humerus articulates here. So basically, all the nerves that branch off of this plexus innervate skeletal muscles of the shoulder, so like the deltoid muscle, and the upper arm, so the bicep and triceps brachii, and even some of the forearm muscles down here that we've talked about before. The lumbar plexus arises basically from the lumbar segments of the spinal cord and innervates the pelvic girdle. So this whole os coxa, the hip bone here, and the lower limbs. So there's a nerve that branches off of there called the femoral nerve. That femoral nerve is one of the major branches off of the lumbar plexus. Back here, I want to point us, when we flip back to a slide, there's a nerve up here called the axillary nerve. I don't think we've talked about. That branches and innervates the deltoid muscle. And then you've got nerves like the radial nerve that runs along the radius, the ulnar nerve that runs along the ulna, and the median nerve that runs right down the middle. So you've got a couple of branches of nerves here that are important. Again, the lumbar plexus branches into the femoral nerve, but then the sacral plexus down here what branches off of it is the sciatic nerve. So if you've ever heard of like sciatica, or anybody that has problems with their sciatic nerve, that sciatic nerve branches off of the sacral plexus. And it's one of the largest nerves in the body. So that nerve's right there where my cursor is. So from talking about just general locations of nerves and some innervation, we're going to talk about some pathways, like sensory pathways, and eventually get into motor pathways. So we're going to talk about how, from the point of sensory receptor activation, how does sensory information, action potential information, make its way to the central nervous system? And it's along 3 neurons. Those 3 neurons are called the first order neuron, which is basically the neuron that either contains the sensory receptor or is the sensory neuron. The second order neuron is an interneuron. We've talked about interneurons back in chapter 7, I believe. And that interneuron carries information from the first order neuron to the second order neuron. The second order neuron then receives that information and carries it to the third order neuron. And that third order neuron is what carries information basically from the thalamus to the primary sensory cortex. Remember, the thalamus in the brain is a relay center. So second order neurons synapse on third order neurons cell bodies in the thalamus. And then the third order neurons carry that information by way of action potentials to the primary sensory cortex. There's one specific example of a pathway here that basically carries, so different sensory pathways are started at different sensory neurons or different sensory receptors. And those different sensory receptors respond to different stimuli. So the stimuli that these sensory receptors respond to in this pathway that send information to the brain carry information, action potential information about fine touch, pressure, vibration, and proprioception. Basically from the point of the receptor that gets activated all the way up to the primary sensory cortex along each of these 3 neurons. So take a look at this figure here. So a sensory receptor right here where my cursor has been activated. So a fine touch receptor or something that would respond to a vibration, or a proprioceptor, right? So basically from one side of the body, there's a sensory receptor that gets activated. We talked about different types of sensory receptors previously. That sensory receptor basically activates and generates an action potential. And the action potential is carried, basically propagated, along the first order neuron all the way up to where it synapses on the second order neuron. So the red is the first order neuron carrying action potential information. There's then a synapse between the first and second order neurons. This is, again, your interneuron. So right there's a cell body of the interneuron. And that interneuron, or second order neuron, carries action potential information to the thalamus, where the cell body of the third order neuron is located. And then that third order neuron receives that information by way of neurotransmitter, right, in a synapse, and sends that information that has been communicated to it all the way up to the primary sensory cortex. Remember that primary sensory cortex is in the cerebral cortex. It's on the post-central gyrus. And there's a term here called the sensory homunculus. So hang on to that word. We'll come back and talk about what a homunculus is. And it's a weird word. Motor pathways only use 2 neurons. And those motor pathways use what's called an upper motor neuron. Its cell body is located in the primary motor cortex. So we just talked about the primary sensory cortex where sensory information is sent. That sensory information gets integrated, and then the primary motor cortex uses that integrated information and decides what to do about it. And that upper motor neuron receives that information about what to do and sends information to the lower motor neuron. And the lower motor neuron, basically, its cell body's in the brainstem or spinal cord, and that communicates, its axon communicates to skeletal muscle. And an example of a specific pathway is the corticospinal pathway that we'll see here on the next slide. So there's a motor homunculus. Again, we'll talk about what that is here on the next couple slides. But right here is the cell bodies of the upper motor neuron. They communicate down through the cerebral cortex, down into the midbrain and brainstem. And there's a bunch of pathways. So follow these pathways. There's some of these pathways, some of these upper motor neurons that synapse basically on a cranial nerve here and here. And those cranial nerves then carry motor information to skeletal muscles of like the head and the neck. Some of these axons of upper motor neurons continue down, cross over to the opposite side of the spinal cord, and then finally synapse in the anterior gray horn right here on the spinal cord on the lower motor neuron. So right there's a cell body of the lower motor neuron. And its axon leads by way of the ventral root, right? So there's the ventral root that carries motor information, we said before, to the spinal nerve, and then axons continue to head out to skeletal muscle to tell that skeletal muscle what to do about that sensory information that had just come in. So this homunculus, it's a map, basically. I said we'd come back and talk about what a homunculus is. It's a map created by basically determining an area of the cerebral cortex that's devoted to a particular body part and function. So the sensory homunculus is a map of the sensory cortex, and the motor homunculus is a map of the motor cortex. And it basically reflects the density or proportion of sensory receptors in every region. So if we flip, I went the wrong direction, back, take a look at how distorted like the face is and how big the hand is compared to the forearm. Basically, if there's motor neuron cell bodies here, this pathway that the axons take will end up heading to a skeletal muscle in the hand. Or if it was here, it would be headed to skeletal muscle in the forearm, or skeletal muscle in the upper leg, or the upper arm, excuse me. Right here's the upper leg and lower leg. And the same thing with the sensory homunculus. If information's making its way up this pathway by way of the first, second, and third order neurons, and it ends up right here in that primary sensory cortex, the sensory receptors that were activated along this pathway were located somewhere in the fingers or hand, right? So that map basically says, okay, here's where this stimulus came from, or here is where this motor information is headed, right? So we've got this map of the primary sensory and primary motor cortex to say, so that your brain is telling you, like, here's where that information came from, or here's where it's going to. In a much simpler pathway, we have reflexes. And reflexes are rapid and almost an automatic response. So think about putting your hand on a hot stove. If your hand's on a hot stove or something that's really warm, like you just boiled a pot of tea and you accidentally stuck your hand on the tea kettle, what would you do? Hopefully you pull your hand away, right? That's a reflex. That's something that protects you, basically preserves homeostasis by allowing really rapid adjustments in function. If you step on a tack, you're going to lift your foot up, right? Or if a dog bites your hand, when you put your hand in its mouth, you pull your hand away, right? That's a reflex to say, oh no, I shouldn't be doing that. We need to protect you. And there's a reflex arc, something that's basically involves a receptor connected to a sensory neuron, connected to the information processing center, connected to a motor neuron, and then eventually an effector. So there's one arc, basically. And an example of a reflex is called a stretch reflex. So I'll show you basically how reflexes occur in your patellar reflex. So if you've ever been in the doctor's office and he took the little hammer and hit on your patellar tendon just below your kneecap, and you kicked your leg when he hit that, that's a reflex. It's called the patellar reflex. That is a stretch reflex. It's one of the simplest and fastest reflex arcs. And doctors often test reflexes to make sure that your nervous system is working properly. So this reflex arc involves a receptor. So you tap the patellar tendon with a hammer, and receptors in the quadriceps muscle stretch. So think about it. Your quadriceps muscles, they're in your thigh, right? The anterior side of your thigh, your femoral region. There's receptors in that muscle that respond to stretching. Remember, they're like mechanoreceptors. They respond to distortions in the membrane. So that receptor, basically when the muscle stretches, because the patellar tendon, so you've got a patellar tendon that's below your kneecap. And that tendon, so touch your kneecap, and then basically roll your fingers below your kneecap and feel that tendon there, right? It connects to your tibia. And when your quadriceps muscles contract, you extend your knee. So go ahead and do that. That tendon basically runs all the way across over top the kneecap and connects on the other side of the kneecap superiorly, or I guess proximally, to your quadriceps. So this is the tendon and ligament that connect your quadriceps to bone. It is mostly the patellar tendon. It's also called the quadriceps ligament patellar tendon that runs over the patella and connects to the quadriceps muscles. So basically, when the receptor in the muscle, because of stretching, is activated, it sends sensory information, action potentials, along the sensory neuron to the information processing center, which is basically the cell body of a motor neuron. That motor neuron cell body receives the information from the sensory neuron and says, okay, that muscle just stretched. We need to contract it so the muscle doesn't get overstretched or damaged. So basically the motor neuron carries that integrated information back to the effector, which is the original muscle that had the receptor, to stimulate it to contract. So all of that's on this slide here. So right here's the hammer. The tendon stretches, and along with that, there's a little bit of stretch in the muscle. So there's the stretch receptor, the mechanoreceptor. It's also right here. That sensory neuron, once the stretch receptor is activated, sends information. Remember, here's the dorsal root, and there's the dorsal root ganglia. So here's a cell body of the sensory neuron. And that sensory neuron synapses on the motor neuron cell body. And that motor neuron then carries motor information, there's the ventral root, out back to the same muscle to tell it to contract. So stretching in that muscle stimulates contraction. That's a reflex. It's a protective reflex to protect the muscle from becoming overstretched and damaged. There's an example of a bunch of different types of reflexes. We went into one specific example, but that's the only thing we're going to cover. And we're going to talk about a couple of diseases here, like ALS, which is also Lou Gehrig's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. I am talking about this because of the water bucket challenge that we had a couple of years ago. But basically, I want you to know about it. So we did this big water bucket challenge a while ago, and people raised money for this disease and to raise awareness for the disease as well. It's basically a degenerative disorder, and it affects motor neurons in the spinal cord, brainstem, and cerebral hemispheres. And it affects both upper and lower motor neurons. So the motor neurons we were just talking about, upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons, these are affected in ALS. And it may affect what's called axonal transport, which is basically the transport of neurotransmitters from the cell body to the axon terminal where they're released. And it basically causes destruction of these neurons, which is what causes atrophy of the associated skeletal muscles. And atrophy in a skeletal muscle is basically the loss of muscle mass in that muscle and the loss of potentially function in that muscle as well. So these individuals with ALS usually lose skeletal muscle function because the neurons that are trying to communicate with that skeletal muscle get damaged. And if a skeletal muscle doesn't have a motor neuron telling it to do its job, it'll stop working. So think about, it's almost like a spinal cord injury. the effect of a spinal cord injury, but it's mostly degenerating over time as opposed to one traumatic event. So it can be really serious. This is Lou Gehrig, and it was kind of discovered in him, which is why it's nicknamed Lou Gehrig's disease. Another type of disorder is multiple sclerosis, and basically that is characterized by your body is attacking the cells that make myelin. So what happens is demyelination, and it affects axons in like the optic nerve, the brain, and the spinal cord. So individuals can lose vision, they can lose their ability to speak or have impairment in speaking, but also balance and basically general motor coordination. It usually onsets around 30 to 40 years, but some people it does earlier. I have a dear friend that she was diagnosed when she was in her teens, but I also know individuals who weren't diagnosed until after 40. So that's typical between 30 and 40. But basically, you're demyelinating axons that need myelin, and remember, myelin speeds up action potential conduction. So where neurons need myelin to communicate, they're losing myelin, and they're losing their ability to generate action potentials and communicate with other cells. So it can be really, really detrimental disease. So right there is like demyelination, right? So this is what happens in MS, which is an awful, awful disease. All right. So I think this here says, yeah, we don't need those two. I will see you in the second half of this chapter. This is the first half. We are going to continue into chapter 8. So I will see you in the next meeting.